If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. The Truth in My Days podcast is sponsored by the Truth in My Days ministry. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello all. Today we're starting a series on the Creed. What is the Creed? Many evangelical scholars think that Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 are actually a creed, a statement of faith in the resurrection of Jesus that the early church created soon after Jesus' death and resurrection, and the apostles taught this creed to Paul after his conversion. If this is correct, they say, it means we have evidence for the resurrection dating only 3 to 5 years after the fact, which is earlier than the gospel books and provides solid evidence for our beliefs. But is this correct? And if not, are we undermining the credibility of the New Testament and its message by promoting it? John and Sonia have been discussing the alleged creed in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, a statement of faith about the resurrection of Jesus Christ that Paul supposedly received from the apostles only a few years after the resurrection of Jesus and incorporated into this letter. This early creed has been hailed as the key proof of the resurrection. But is it? Or is it a claim causing more harm than good? We have seen the apologists emphasizing this supposed creed and downplaying the gospel books, which is problematic because the gospel books are early and far more detailed than these few verses in 1 Corinthians. We have seen that there's actually no proof for the claim that the creed dates within 3 to 5 years after the resurrection. It may, in fact, come from later than Matthew, Mark, and even Luke. And we asked whether this passage is in fact a creed or not, and began looking at the evidence offered and found it wanting. The supposed primitive vocabulary in this creed is not primitive at all, being found also in the Gospel books and Acts, and the so-called parallelism and stylized content seems to be simply a series of bullet points written by Paul to defend the truth of the resurrection. Now, let's continue this discussion. We hope you enjoy this multi-part series.
We notice also, by the way, just a bit off topic, that Paul does not mention the empty tomb in his summary of the points proving the resurrection. As we've said elsewhere, the empty tomb is really not a good apologetic argument for the resurrection, and Paul does not bother to mention it.
Can you remind us of why not?
Well, because the empty tomb did not convince anybody on site. It didn't convince Mary Magdalene, the women, the apostles. You remember Mary Magdalene, when she went to the tomb, she was actually spoken to by angels. And then shortly after that, she's alone at the tomb, and she's weeping, and Jesus appears behind her and asks her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." That's John 20, verse 13. Listen to that answer. The tomb is empty. She's seen it's empty. She's heard the message from the angels. Does she for a moment think he rose from the dead? No. Jesus is behind her. She hasn't seen him yet. She's heard his voice. They've taken away my Lord. Okay? Somebody must have taken away the body, laid it somewhere else. That's why she's upset. Didn't convince her. It did not convince the apostles. In Luke 24, 9-11, we read, "Then they returned from the tomb and told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. And their words seemed to them like idle tales, and they did not believe them." People might say, well, just because they're women, but it really isn't, because in Mark, we have the account of the appearance to 2 disciples who went and walked in the countryside. That's probably the reference to the appearance to Cleopas and the other unnamed disciple on the road to Emmaus, described in Luke. Clearly, at least one of them is a male. And they went and told the others, and they were not believed either. So when Jesus showed up to them in Luke 24, you remember he stood in the midst of them, he said to them, "Peace to you," but they were terrified and frightened and supposed they had seen a spirit. Like they had heard, they knew the tomb was empty. They heard from the people who'd seen the risen Jesus. They still didn't believe. And when he shows up, they think it's a ghost. They just don't believe. They're hard to convince. And he has to say, "Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet, ate some food in their presence. They were hard to convince because it's a hard thing to believe. The story of doubting Thomas, who's not there with them, and later they tell him that Jesus is back, and he says, "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." And Jesus then shows up and invites him to do that very thing, and Thomas gives the only legitimate answer to that: "My Lord and my God." So the empty tomb didn't convince anybody, nor should it have. Almost any explanation for an empty tomb is more credible than that a dead man rose. And that's important. These were not stupid, primitive people who are ready to believe that. They knew dead people don't come back. They did. It's the post-resurrection appearances that was the crucial proof, which is why that's what Paul mentions, and that's what he's highlighting in these bullet points, rather than the empty tomb.
Well, but if people saw, for example, Lazarus being raised from the dead, and they saw the risen saints, then maybe they're starting to get used to the idea of somebody rising from the dead.
The resurrection of Lazarus and of the son of the widow of Nain, and a couple in the Old Testament as well, were not like Jesus' resurrection. Two reasons. One, they came back to life and then continued to live their normal lives and died. Jesus came back, he was glorified, and then he ascended into heaven. So it's fundamentally different. Jesus rose never to die again. The other thing is, as we see in Romans chapter 1, where it says that Jesus is declared to be the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead, Jesus was making grandiose claims about himself. He's the Son of God. People must honor him even as they honor the Father, same way as they honor the Father. And he kept saying that the proof that he is who he said would be his resurrection from the dead. So when he rose, God was endorsing all of his claims. The third difference is that Jesus rose himself. He says in John chapter 10, "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down that I may take it up again." People could see the miracle worker Jesus raising Lazarus. They could see the miracle worker Jesus raising the son of the widow of Nain. They could see Jesus raising the daughter of Jairus. But when Jesus himself is dead, who's going to raise him?
What about the saints, though?
What about the saints?
Well, that's not an example where you can see Jesus raising them, is it?
No, but you didn't see how it happened. Jesus, you saw him dead, you saw him sealed in a tomb. So who came along to raise him? He told them. And John chapter 2 tells us this as well. He said that, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it in 3 days." And we're told in John that after he had done this, his apostles remembered that he had said this, and they believed. The Old Testament saints were raised, but again, they would have gone back to living normal lives and then dying like anybody else.
Please note that this is a multi-part series. If you have missed any episodes and would like to listen to them, they will all be available on our YouTube channel and on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. You can find the links to these on our website, truthinmydays.com, or you can look for Truth in My Days on YouTube as one word.
Okay, so far it makes sense to see this as Paul's own list of bullet points defending the resurrection. Is there other evidence that 15:3-7 is a creed?
Well, yes, certainly scholars do point to other factors that they claim indicate this passage is a creed, but we've already looked at a couple of them and have seen that they failed to do that. The supposed primitive phrases and the the stylized content doesn't do it. So let's look at what else they offer. They will say that, as you recall, the original text uses Kephas or Cephas for Peter, which is his Aramaic name. So what they're trying to suggest is that the creed, when it's very early, would have been done by Aramaic-speaking believers in Jerusalem. They would have used the Aramaic form of Jesus' name, not the later name that Jesus gave him. Now, why they would do that is not entirely clear, because he was being called Peter already in the gospel books. But let's assume that, yes, they want to use the Aramaic form. Does that prove that this was written early from a creed by Aramaic-speaking Jews? Well, interestingly, how often does the name Cephas show up in the New Testament? How often? What do you think? It shows up 5 times in Paul's letters. And how often does he call Peter Peter in his letters? 5 times.
So half and half.
Half and half. And all of these are in 2 of his letters, Galatians and 1 Corinthians. Now, the NIV, which uses the critical text, so the ESV also, the NASB, would use Cephas 2 more times, both in Galatians, though. So what does that mean? That means that Paul uses the term Cephas, as often to refer to Peter as he uses Peter. And he does it in these 2 letters, Galatians and 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians, he mentions Peter 4 times, other than this passage, 5 times in total, and always calls him Cephas. He calls Peter Cephas in 1 Corinthians 1:12. Is that part of a creed?
I suppose not.
Nobody would suggest that for a moment. But in 1 Corinthians 3:22, also not part of a creed, he calls Peter Cephas. 1 Corinthians 9:5, he refers to Peter as Cephas. And here in 1 Corinthians 15:5, then he calls him Cephas. So what he's calling him in this passage is no different from what he calls him throughout the entire letter. So he's not calling him Cephas in 1 Corinthians 15:5 because it comes from a pre-Pauline creed, but because that's what he calls him. Apparently the Corinthians knew him by the name Cephas, and that's what Paul uses in referring to him. You cannot possibly argue that this is part of a creed because it uses Cephas, Peter's Aramaic name, there when Paul uses that very same Aramaic name every single time he refers to him throughout the entire letter. Unless you want to argue that the entire letter is a creed, which nobody does. So that is also not legitimate evidence for a supposed creed. So that leaves one argument, the biggie, the sine qua non, the linchpin, the without which not. If this is the one that's really supposed to be the biggie that makes it a creed, and everything else is just supporting evidence, which, as we've seen, is not supporting evidence at all. And this is the so-called technical rabbinic terms. How did Habermas put it? Paul introduces it with the words received and delivered, which are technical rabbinic terms indicating he's passing along holy tradition. Craig Blomberg put it this way: Paul uses technical language to indicate that he was passing along this oral tradition in relatively fixed form. The Creation Ministries International website says, first, Paul uses the words delivered and received, which are technical rabbinic terms indicating that he is passing along a holy tradition. What do you think? Does that sound convincing at all?
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part, same time and same place. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. If you like our content, please share this information with family and friends. It helps us a lot. We also would love to hear from you. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching Truth in My Days as one word again. Truth in My Days as one word. No spaces in between. Or reach us by email at info@truthinmydays.com. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.